When the First Age ended and Morgoth was finally cast into the void, Middle-earth did not enter an age of peace so much as an age of quiet uncertainty, because while the greatest source of destruction had been removed, the scars he left behind remained woven into the world itself, shaping lands, peoples, and memories in ways that could not simply be undone. And in this fragile calm the Valar withdrew from direct involvement, believing that the children of Ilúvatar must now shape their own future. Yet, this withdrawal created a space where unresolved tensions could grow unnoticed, and the world that followed was one marked not by open tyranny, but by exhaustion, by a deep weariness carried especially by the Elves, who had seen light fade, realms fall, and beauty pass beyond recall. And it was within this emotional landscape that the conditions for the Rings of Power slowly emerged, because fear no longer took the form of fire and armies, but of loss, change, and decay, subtle anxieties that linger quietly rather than announcing themselves through violence. And while men began to rise into prominence, their shorter lives lending urgency to ambition and achievement, the Elves became increasingly aware that Middle-earth itself was slipping away from them, growing older, heavier, and less responsive to their presence. And this sense of fading did not come from despair alone, but from memory, as they could still recall a world unmarred by Morgoth's corruption, a memory that made the present feel like a long decline rather than a new beginning. And in this atmosphere, preservation began to seem as important as victory, stability as desirable as freedom. Because after centuries of upheaval, the idea of holding something still carried immense appeal, and it is important to understand that this desire did not arise from evil intent, but from grief and fatigue, from the simple wish to prevent further loss. And yet, Tolkien is careful to show that even reasonable desires, when pursued without acceptance of change, can open the door to domination, because the world after Morgoth was not empty of darkness, only quieter. And into this quiet stepped Sauron, no longer a destroyer seeking ruin for its own sake, but a patient will observing a world afraid of disorder, ready to offer structure, continuity, and control to those who feared fading more than they feared submission. And so the origin of the One Ring does not begin with fire or incantation, but with a world longing for permanence, a world tired of endings, and it is in this longing, more than in malice, that the true foundation of the ring was laid. After the defeat of Morgoth and the end of the First Age, Sauron did not vanish from the world in defeat or despair, but entered a long period of observation and internal transformation, because unlike his former master, he was never driven by destruction for its own sake, and this distinction is crucial to understanding how his vision evolved, as Sauron's deepest impulse was not chaos but order, not annihilation but control, and when Morgoth fell, Sauron was faced with a choice that Tolkien presents quietly but decisively, the choice between repentance and persistence, and for a brief moment repentance was possible, as Sauron feared the judgment of the Valar and recognized the ruin that had come from unrestrained domination. Yet this fear was not rooted in humility so much as self-preservation. And when the Valar withdrew from Middle-earth, Sauron's fear gradually transformed into calculation, as he realized that the world was no longer under constant divine scrutiny, and that space, silence, and time now existed in which a subtler form of power could grow. And during this long interval, Sauron did not immediately rebuild armies or fortresses, but studied the altered nature of Middle-earth, recognizing that the age of open terror had passed, and that domination would now require persuasion, structure, and gradual influence, rather than overwhelming force. And this realization marked the birth of his new vision, a vision shaped by the belief that the greatest vulnerability of the free peoples was not their strength, but their fear of instability, their exhaustion after centuries of war, and their longing for continuity in a world that felt increasingly fragile. And Sauron understood that domination imposed through violence alone provoked resistance, but domination offered as protection could be welcomed, and this insight allowed him to reframe his ambitions not as conquest, but as stewardship, a word that masks control behind the language of care. And Tolkien is careful to show that Sauron's self-conception during this period was not that of a tyrant in waiting, but of a necessary regulator, someone who believed that Middle-earth required firm guidance to avoid slipping into fragmentation, decay, and endless conflict. And this belief, while deeply corrupted, was not irrational within the context of the world he observed, because the withdrawal of the Valar had left Middle-earth politically and spiritually decentralized, populated by realms with competing priorities, fading elven influence, rising human ambition, and lingering scars from Morgoth's wars. And to Sauron, this decentralization appeared not as freedom, but as inefficiency, waste, and risk, and so his new vision emerged from a fundamental disagreement with the moral architecture of Tolkien's world. Because where Ilúvatar's design values freedom even at the cost of suffering, Sauron came to believe that suffering itself justified the removal of freedom, and this belief allowed him to reinterpret domination as benevolence, transforming control into a moral necessity rather than an act of malice. And it is within this reframing that the seeds of the One Ring were truly planted, long before any metal was forged or fire kindled, because Sauron's vision required a tool capable of unifying wills without constant presence, a means of influence that could extend his order across distance and time, and this requirement arose from another lesson learned from Morgoth's failure, that domination dependent on the ruler's direct attention is inherently fragile, because it collapses when focus is divided or resistance emerges elsewhere. And Sauron, more patient and methodical, sought a system rather than a spectacle, a structure that could persist even when he withdrew from view. And this system needed to align with the desires of others rather than crush them outright, making them participants in their own subjugation. And thus Sauron began to consider not how to enslave Middle-earth through fear, but how to reorganize it through cooperation conditioned by power. And this is why deception becomes central to his new approach, because deception allows control to operate invisibly, shaping outcomes without announcing authority. And Sauron understood that the most stable form of domination is the one that feels voluntary, where subjects believe they are acting freely, even as their options are narrowed by an unseen hand. And this insight led him to focus his attention on the Elves, not because they were weak, but because they were deeply invested in preservation, memory, and continuity, values that could be redirected toward control if framed correctly. And Sauron recognized that the Elves' desire to preserve Middle-earth as they remembered it could be leveraged, because preservation, when pursued without acceptance of change, becomes indistinguishable from domination, as it seeks to arrest time itself, and by aligning his vision with this desire, Sauron could present himself not as an enemy, but as an ally offering tools to hold back decay. And this strategy required patience, because trust cannot be forced, it must be cultivated, and so Sauron's new vision unfolded slowly, through study, restraint, and careful positioning, allowing centuries to pass while he refined his understanding of the world's psychological landscape. And during this time he adopted forms that concealed his true nature, not merely to hide, but to listen, to learn how different peoples justified their actions, how leaders rationalized authority, and how fear and hope shaped decision-making. And this period of observation deepened Sauron's conviction that Middle-earth required a guiding will, one strong enough to coordinate disparate realms toward stability, yet subtle enough to avoid provoking unified resistance. And in this sense, Sauron's vision was not small-minded or short-sighted, but tragically comprehensive, because it sought to solve the problem of freedom by eliminating its risks. And Tolkien presents this vision as seductive, precisely because it addresses real wounds in the world, offering answers to grief, decline, and uncertainty, yet at the cost of reducing all moral choice to obedience. And this reduction is what ultimately defines Sauron's path, because once he concluded that freedom was the source of disorder, every subsequent action became justified in his mind, transforming domination into duty. And by the time Sauron emerged openly again, his vision was fully formed, no longer that of a servant seeking power, but of a self-appointed architect of the world, convinced that only through centralized will could Middle-earth be saved from itself. And it is this conviction, calm, rational, and absolute, that makes Sauron's new vision far more dangerous than Morgoth's rage, because it does not announce itself as evil, but as order. And in doing so, it prepares the world, quietly and patiently, for The creation of a ring not merely to rule, but to organize, to harmonize, and ultimately to erase the distinction between guidance and domination, setting the stage for a deception so complete that even those who opposed tyranny would, for a time, believe they were choosing freely. Among all the peoples of Middle-earth, it was the Elves who felt the passing of time most sharply after the fall of Morgoth, not because they feared death, which was largely absent from their experience, but because they were condemned to remember, and this distinction is essential to understanding why the desire to preserve became so powerful, because for the Elves, memory was not a distant recollection, but a living presence, an ever-present awareness of what had been lost and what could never be fully restored. And as the Second Age unfolded, this burden of memory deepened as they watched the world subtly change around them, forests thinning, lands reshaping, and the spiritual intensity of Middle-earth gradually fading, a process Tolkien describes not as sudden collapse, but as a slow dimming, almost imperceptible in any single moment, yet devastating when considered across centuries. And this fading was not merely environmental or political, but metaphysical, because the Elves understood that Middle-earth itself was moving away from the condition that had once allowed their culture, art, and presence to flourish fully. And unlike men, whose mortality gave urgency and renewal to their ambitions, the Elves were bound to the world until its end, meaning that every loss was permanent, every decline cumulative, and every passing age a narrowing of possibility rather than a transition. And this awareness produced a quiet anxiety that permeated even their greatest realms, an anxiety not rooted in fear of conquest, but in fear of erosion, of watching beauty unravel, not through violence, but through neglect and inevitability. And Tolkien is careful to show that this fear was neither petty nor selfish, because the Elves had poured themselves into Middle-earth, shaping it with craft, song, and memory, and to watch it diminish felt like watching a part of themselves dissolve. And it is here that preservation begins to take on moral weight, because when loss is constant and irreversible, the desire to hold fast to what remains can appear not only reasonable but virtuous. And many Elves came to believe that preventing further fading was a responsibility rather than a refusal to accept change. And this belief gained strength as the Valar withdrew and the Elves found themselves increasingly isolated, no longer guided openly by higher powers, yet still bearing the knowledge of what had been and what was being lost. And in this isolation the temptation to act independently grew, as did the conviction that waiting passively for decline was itself a form of failure. And Tolkien presents this tension with great subtlety, because the Elves were not seeking domination over others, but stability for themselves, a way to sustain realms of beauty and memory against the slow, grinding force of time. And this distinction is crucial, because it explains why Sauron's approach was effective, as he did not offer conquest or supremacy, but tools, knowledge, and methods, framed explicitly as preservation, as a means of holding Middle-earth in a state closer to its remembered glory. And this offer resonated because it aligned with an existing desire rather than introducing a new one. And it is important to note that not all Elves responded equally, as figures like Gil-galad remained wary of any power that promised permanence, understanding instinctively that to freeze the world was to violate its deeper order. Yet others, particularly those deeply invested in craft and lore, found the promise compelling because craft itself is an act of preservation, a way of fixing meaning, beauty, and intention into material form, and the Elves had always been masters of such craft, making their attraction to the idea of rings that could preserve realms almost inevitable. And Tolkien emphasizes that this attraction did not stem from arrogance alone, but from grief, from a long history of watching beloved things pass beyond reach. And in this emotional context, preservation began to feel like a moral imperative rather than a temptation. And this is where the tragedy deepens, because preservation, when elevated above all other values, begins to resemble control, as it seeks to arrest change regardless of consent or consequence. And while the Elves did not initially seek to impose their will upon others, the tools designed to preserve their realms carried within them the logic of domination, because to stop change requires authority over time, matter, and will. And this logic was subtle, easily overlooked when framed as protection rather than power. And Sauron understood this perfectly, because he recognized that the Elves' fear of fading could be redirected. that their desire to preserve could be expanded beyond gardens and cities into a broader impulse to stabilize the world itself. And this redirection did not require lies at first, only emphasis, reinforcing the idea that decline was unacceptable and that action was necessary. And in this way, Sauron's influence blended seamlessly into elvish concerns, appearing less as an intrusion and more as a continuation of their own reasoning. And Tolkien's moral insight here is precise, because he shows that evil often advances not by inventing new desires, but by exploiting existing ones, amplifying them until they eclipse all others. And for the elves, preservation began to overshadow acceptance, continuity to overshadow freedom, and memory to overshadow humility. And this imbalance created fertile ground for the rings of power, because rings are circular, unending, symbolic of continuity without conclusion, perfectly aligned with the elvish longing to remain, to endure unchanged. And yet Tolkien does not condemn the elves outright for this longing, instead presenting it as deeply human in its structure, even if elves are immortal, because the fear of loss and the desire to hold on to meaning are universal, and it is this universality that gives the story its weight, reminding us that the path toward domination often begins with love rather than hatred, with the wish to protect rather than to conquer, and, as the elves pursued preservation through craft, they moved closer to a threshold where assistance became dependence, where tools designed to safeguard freedom began to require oversight, coordination, and ultimately control. And this threshold was not crossed in a single decision, but approached gradually through collaboration, trust, and shared purpose, making the eventual betrayal all the more devastating. Because by the time the elves realized that preservation had become a conduit for domination, the structures enabling that domination were already in place, and Tolkien's portrayal of this process is deliberately slow and reflective, mirroring the way moral compromises accumulate quietly over time. And in doing so, he invites the reader to consider not only the elves' fate, but the broader question of how societies respond to decline, whether they accept change with grace or attempt to halt it through force. And this question lies at the heart of the One Ring's origin, because the ring was not forged to destroy the elves, but to offer them what they feared losing most: permanence, continuity, and control over a world slipping away. And it is precisely because this offer addressed a genuine wound that it was so difficult to refuse, setting the stage for a tragedy born not of malice, but of love stretched beyond its rightful limits. When Sauron finally chose to step back into the affairs of Middle-earth openly, he did not do so as a conqueror or a dark lord crowned in fire, but under the carefully constructed identity of Annatar, the Lord of Gifts, a name that was itself a strategy, because it framed his presence not as a demand, but as an offering. And this framing was essential, as the world he was entering was wary of domination, but receptive to guidance, eager for knowledge that promised stability without the cost of submission, and Annatar's appearance was calculated to inspire trust, presenting himself as a being of wisdom and beauty, aligned with the powers of the West, bringing insights that seemed to bridge the gap left by the withdrawal of the Valar. And Tolkien is deliberate in showing that Annatar did not arrive among the elves bearing threats or commands, but patience, listening first, observing the rhythms of elvish society, learning how pride and humility, fear and hope intertwined within their greatest realms, and it was through this attentiveness that he learned where to speak and where to remain silent, because influence gained too quickly arouses suspicion, while influence earned through apparent restraint feels deserved. And Annatar understood this deeply, allowing time to work in his favor, offering knowledge gradually, never more than was requested, creating the impression that he was responding to need rather than shaping it. And this impression was critical, because it allowed the elves to believe that the direction of their craft remained their own, that Annatar was a collaborator rather than a guide. And Tolkien's portrayal of this deception is subtle, because Annatar does not initially lie outright. Instead, he reframes truth, emphasizing certain possibilities while omitting consequence, a form of manipulation far more effective than falsehood. And among the elves, reactions to Annatar were divided, with figures such as Gil-galad and Elrond sensing an unease, They could not fully articulate an intuition that something in Annatar's presence did not align with the deeper patterns of the world, yet this intuition struggled to compete with the tangible benefits Annatar offered because he spoke to existing concerns, to the desire to preserve, to heal, and to enhance. And these concerns were most strongly felt in Eregion, a realm defined by craft, experimentation, and the pursuit of mastery, where Celebrimbor and the Gwaithai Mir Dain welcomed knowledge eagerly, believing that skill refined through learning could serve beauty rather than power. And Annatar positioned himself perfectly within this culture, presenting his teachings as extensions of Elvish tradition, rather than foreign impositions, encouraging collaboration while subtly guiding direction. And this guidance was never explicit, instead operating through suggestion, inspiration, and the careful validation of certain ambitions over others. And it is here that the title Lord of Gifts reveals its full meaning, because a gift creates obligation without force, binding giver and receiver through gratitude rather than fear. And Annatar's gifts were not objects at first, but ideas, techniques, insights into the unseen properties of matter and will, each one deepening dependence while appearing to empower independence. And Tolkien emphasizes that this exchange altered the moral landscape of Eregion quietly, as craft shifted from expression to optimization, from celebration to preservation, from artistry to function. And this shift did not feel like corruption, but like progress, because it aligned with the elves' desire to hold back fading, to make their works endure beyond the natural limits imposed by time. And Annatar reinforced this desire by framing decay as an enemy to be resisted rather than a condition to be accepted, subtly reframing the elves' relationship with the world. And it is important to understand that Annatar never presented himself as ruler or authority, but as servant of a greater good, a facilitator of potential. And this self-effacing posture allowed him to bypass resistance that would have arisen had he sought control directly, because control offered openly invites defiance, while control offered as assistance invites collaboration. And Tolkien's insight here is profound, because he shows that the most effective domination is the one that convinces its subjects they are advancing their own goals, and Annatar's success in Eregion was built on this principle, as the elves increasingly integrated his methods into their craft without recognizing that those methods carried assumptions about order, hierarchy, and coordination that mirrored Sauron's own worldview, and this integration was not imposed but chosen, reinforcing the illusion of autonomy even as pathways narrowed. And when doubts did arise, Annatar's response was never confrontation, but reassurance, presenting skepticism as understandable while gently positioning it as unnecessary caution in the face of opportunity. And this rhetorical strategy allowed him to appear reasonable while isolating dissent, because those who resisted found themselves portrayed not as protectors, but as obstacles to progress. And this social dynamic further entrenched Annatar's influence, as agreement became synonymous with cooperation and hesitation with regression. And Tolkien uses this progression to illustrate how communities can drift toward moral compromise without ever consciously deciding to do so, because each individual step appears rational, even benevolent, when viewed in isolation, and Annatar's mastery lay in orchestrating these steps into a coherent direction without revealing the destination. And as years passed, the elves of Eregion grew increasingly reliant on the knowledge Annatar provided, not because they could not function without it, but because it had become integrated into their vision of what was possible. And once possibility expands, relinquishing it feels like loss, making retreat emotionally costly. And this emotional cost is central to the deception, because it binds the future to the continuation of the present path, discouraging reevaluation. And by the time Annatar's true nature was revealed, the foundations had already been laid, the techniques mastered, the ambitions refined, and the conceptual framework for the rings of power firmly established, making separation from his influence not only difficult but destabilizing. And Tolkien's portrayal of Annatar thus becomes a meditation on the nature of trust, showing how trust built on shared goals can be exploited when those goals are subtly redefined. And in this sense, Annatar did not conquer the elves of Eregion, but accompanied them, walking beside them as they moved toward a threshold they did not recognize until it was too late. a threshold where gift became chain, collaboration became dependence, and the promise of preservation quietly transformed into the architecture of domination. The crafting of the rings of power did not begin as an act of domination, but as an extension of elvish artistry pushed to its furthest limits. Because in a region the making of objects had always been more than utility or ornament, it was a way of translating memory, intention, and identity into enduring form, and, under the influence of Annatar, this ancient tradition began to shift from expression toward preservation, from celebrating what is fleeting to attempting to arrest it. And this shift marks the true beginning of the ring's significance, because Tolkien is careful to show that the rings were not created to rule others at first, but to enhance the natural capacities of their bearers, to strengthen realms against decay, and to preserve beauty against the slow erosion of time. And this intention is crucial because it explains why the rings were so dangerous even before Sauron's direct intervention, as they embodied a desire to impose continuity on a world designed to change. And Celebrimbor, greatest of the elvish smiths of the Second Age, stood at the center of this transformation, not as a villain or a fool, but as a figure of immense skill and genuine hope, someone who believed that craft, guided by wisdom, could heal rather than harm. And Tolkien presents Celebrimbor as deeply aware of the weight of legacy, as the grandson of Feanor, burdened by the shadow of his lineage and determined to use his gifts not for possession or pride, but for restoration. And it is precisely this desire to redeem craft that makes him receptive to Annatar's teachings, because Annatar framed his knowledge not as a path to supremacy, but as a refinement of technique, a deeper understanding of how matter, will, and the unseen forces of the world interact. And this framing allowed the Gwaith I Myrdain to believe that they were advancing elvish tradition rather than departing from it. And under this belief, ring-making emerged as a logical culmination of centuries of experimentation, because rings as objects are uniquely suited to the task of preservation, circular, unbroken, symbolic of continuity without end. And Tolkien's symbolism here is deliberate, as the very shape of the rings reflects the desire to hold things in place, to prevent dissolution. And as the craft advanced, the rings were imbued with powers aligned to the bearer's intent, enhancing perception, influence, and endurance, not through brute force, but through subtle alignment of will and world, and this subtlety made them especially appealing, because they did not announce power openly, but integrated it seamlessly into the user's identity, allowing the bearer to feel unchanged even as their capacity to shape reality expanded. And this is one of Tolkien's most important insights into corruption, that the most dangerous power is the one that feels natural, an extension of self rather than an external imposition. And as the rings took shape, the elves believed they were creating tools to safeguard their realms, to slow fading, to preserve memory and beauty in a world growing increasingly unstable. And Annatar encouraged this belief by emphasizing harmony, balance, and order, carefully avoiding any language of rule or command. And it is important to note that at this stage, Sauron did not yet reveal his ultimate design, because the success of the rings required genuine belief in their benign purpose, and Tolkien underscores that deception works best when it aligns with truth rather than contradicting it. And there was truth in the elves' fear, truth in their grief, and truth in their desire to protect what they loved, and the rings were crafted within this emotional and philosophical framework, making them potent not merely as artifacts but as expressions of longing. And as more rings were made, the craft itself began to reshape the worldview of those involved, as mastery bred confidence, and confidence bred the sense that further intervention was justified, that if one could slow decay in a glade or city, perhaps one could do so across entire realms. And this expansion of ambition did not feel like overreach, but like responsibility, as if possessing the means to preserve imposed an obligation to use it. And Tolkien is precise in illustrating how moral thresholds are crossed not through sudden choices, but through incremental normalization, as each successful application of craft made the next seem reasonable. And within this progression, the rings became increasingly sophisticated, channeling not only the natural abilities of their bearers, but their desires. amplifying intent and binding it to the structure of the world. And this binding is essential to understanding why the rings later prove vulnerable to domination, because to preserve something against change requires exerting will over it, and any system built on the exertion of will is susceptible to being overridden by a stronger will. And Annatar understood this from the beginning, designing the underlying principles of the craft to be compatible with centralized control, even while presenting them as neutral techniques, and the elves, focused on immediate benefits, did not yet perceive the implications of this architecture, because the rings functioned as intended, sustaining realms, enhancing wisdom, and delaying decay, reinforcing confidence in the path chosen. And Tolkien emphasizes that this success is what sealed their danger, because success validates method, discouraging reconsideration. And as the rings of power multiplied, the elves came to see them not as experiments, but as solutions, tools that could address the fundamental problem of fading. And in doing so, they unknowingly accepted the premise that the world required correction, a premise that aligned perfectly with Sauron's worldview, even if their intentions differed. And this alignment is the tragedy at the heart of the ring's creation, because it shows how shared goals can mask incompatible values, as both elves and Sauron sought order and preservation, but for fundamentally different reasons. And while the elves wished to protect freedom and beauty, Sauron wished to eliminate unpredictability, and the rings, as crafted, could serve either purpose depending on who held ultimate control. And this duality is why Tolkien portrays the rings not as inherently evil objects, but as morally unstable, amplifying the desires and assumptions embedded within them, and it is only later with the forging of the One Ring that this instability becomes absolute. But the foundation is laid here in the workshops of Eregion, where craft becomes system, preservation becomes power, and the line between safeguarding and governing begins to blur. Not through malice, but through the quiet confidence of those who believe they are acting for the good of the world. And in this way, the craft of the Rings of Power becomes a cautionary tale about the limits of intention, reminding us that tools shaped by fear of loss often carry within them the seeds of domination, even when forged by hands that seek only to protect what they love. The forging of the One Ring marks the moment in which Sauron's long vision, patience, and deception finally crystallize into a single act of will, transforming years of subtle influence into a structure of domination designed to endure beyond his physical presence. And Tolkien is careful to frame this moment not as a sudden escalation, but as the logical conclusion of everything that came before, because by the time Sauron withdrew from Eregion to enact his final design, the conceptual groundwork had already been laid, the Rings of Power existed, the principles of their craft were established, and the elves believed themselves to be acting independently, unaware that the very architecture of their creations was compatible with a deeper form of control. And it is crucial to understand that the One Ring was not forged alongside the others, nor as a natural extension of collaborative craft, but in secrecy, in isolation, at Orodruin, the place where the fabric of Middle-earth itself was, most closely aligned with Sauron's native power, because Mount Doom was not merely a forge of convenience, but a location saturated with Morgoth's lingering corruption, a wound in the world where Sauron could pour his will directly into matter without interference. And Tolkien emphasizes that the act of forging the ring required more than technical skill. It required the transference of Sauron's own essence, because the ring was not meant to be a tool he wielded externally, but an extension of his being, a vessel through which his will could operate even in his absence. And this decision reflects Sauron's understanding of the limitations that had undone Morgoth, that power concentrated solely in the self is vulnerable, while power distributed through systems can persist. And so Sauron bound a significant portion of his native strength, malice, and intent into the ring, accepting a form of self-limitation in exchange for pervasive influence. And this choice reveals the cold rationality of his vision, because unlike Morgoth, who squandered his power in acts of destruction, Sauron invested his power strategically, embedding it within an object that could shape the world indirectly. And Tolkien presents this as a moment of profound irony, because in seeking absolute control, Sauron made himself dependent on a single artifact, binding his fate to the success of a system he believed he could manage perfectly. And the forging itself is described not in detail of flame and hammer, but in consequence, as Tolkien avoids spectacle in favor of meaning, emphasizing that the true horror of the ring lies not in its creation, but in its purpose, because the one ring was designed to rule the other rings, to perceive them, to influence their bearers, and ultimately to subordinate their will to Sauron's own. And this dominance was not intended to be overt or immediate, but gradual, operating through amplification rather than command, strengthening existing tendencies toward preservation, order, and control until alignment became obedience. And it is here that the brilliance and danger of the ring converge, because it does not erase individuality outright, but reframes it, encouraging bearers to believe that their choices align naturally with a greater order. And Tolkien's insight is that domination achieved through perceived harmony is more stable than domination imposed through fear. And the ring embodies this principle perfectly, because it does not force submission directly, but creates conditions under which resistance feels irrational, inefficient, or harmful to the greater good. And Sauron's inscription upon the ring, spoken in the Black Speech, articulates this philosophy explicitly, reducing all diversity to hierarchy, all freedom to function, and all wills to instruments of a single purpose. And yet the ring's power was not instantaneous, because its success depended on concealment, on the elves' ignorance of its existence. And this is why Sauron did not immediately reveal himself, instead allowing the rings of power to be used, trusted, and integrated into elvish society before activating his design. And when the One Ring was completed and Sauron first put it on, Tolkien describes a moment of sudden awareness among the elves as they perceived the intrusion into their thoughts, the pressure upon their wills, and the presence of an external mind seeking to order them. And this moment is critical, because it reveals that the ring's power was never subtle in its intent, only in its preparation. And the elves' immediate response, removing their rings, demonstrates that domination is most effective when unseen, and that once revealed, even the most sophisticated system of control can provoke resistance. And this resistance forced Sauron into open war sooner than he had planned, revealing a flaw in his otherwise meticulous strategy. Because while the ring could dominate those who wore the lesser rings, it could not compel submission without participation, and Tolkien uses this failure to underscore the central theme of his work, that freedom, once recognized, cannot be fully extinguished by external force alone. And yet, the forging of the One Ring irrevocably altered the balance of power in Middle-earth, because even in failure it created a focal point around which domination could be organized, a single object capable of amplifying ambition, corrupting intention, and reshaping history across ages. And Sauron's investment of self into the ring meant that his power was now both greater and more fragile, more far-reaching yet dependent, capable of exerting influence across vast distances, but vulnerable to loss. And this duality defines the ring's role throughout the rest of the legendarium, because it is at once the source of Sauron's strength and the key to his undoing. And Tolkien presents this not as poetic justice, but as a structural consequence of domination itself, because systems built on absolute control inevitably concentrate risk, creating points of failure that cannot be eliminated without relinquishing control altogether. And the ring's creation thus becomes a mirror of Sauron's philosophy, precise, logical, comprehensive, and ultimately self-defeating, because by embedding his will into an object, Sauron attempted to make domination permanent, but in doing so he bound his existence to something that could be resisted, hidden, lost, and eventually destroyed. And this paradox lies at the heart of the ring's story, because it shows that the desire to eliminate uncertainty produces its own vulnerabilities. And in this sense, the forging of the One Ring is not only the birth of a weapon, but the moment when Sauron's vision becomes irrevocably constrained by the very order he sought to impose, setting in motion a chain of events that will carry the ring through betrayal, loss, and rediscovery, shaping the fate of Middle-earth long after its maker believes control to be assured. The moment the One Ring was first worn by Sauron marks one of the most psychologically devastating instances in the history of Middle-earth, because it was not accompanied by thunder, fire, or proclamation, but by sudden clarity, as the elves who bore the rings of power became aware, almost simultaneously, that they were no longer alone within their own thoughts. And Tolkien is precise in describing this realization, not as confusion, but as intrusion, a sensation of pressure and alignment, as if an external will had reached inward and attempted to organize perception itself. And this experience shattered the illusion that the rings were independent instruments of preservation, because in that instant the elves understood that their craft, however noble in intention, had been built upon foundations that allowed domination to flow inward as easily as power flowed outward. And this realization was immediate and unanimous among those who wore the rings, despite the distance separating them, because the ring did not operate through physical proximity, but through a shared metaphysical architecture, binding the bearers together within a system Sauron had designed to transcend space. And it is here that Tolkien reveals the true horror of the ring, because it does not merely influence action, but seeks to synchronize thought, to make difference feel like error and independence feel inefficient. And the elves, whose identity was deeply rooted in memory, autonomy, and subtlety, experienced this as a violation of the self, a kind of metaphysical trespass that could not be rationalized or ignored. And their response was swift, not because they had anticipated betrayal, but because they recognized immediately that participation, even passive participation, would mean surrendering the very freedom they sought to preserve. And so they removed their rings, choosing vulnerability over control. And this act of removal is one of the most significant moral decisions in Tolkien's legendarium, because it demonstrates that awareness can still disrupt domination, even when systems are already in place. And Tolkien emphasizes that this choice came at great cost, because by relinquishing the rings, the elves accepted the return of fading, the loss of the preservation they had worked so carefully to achieve, and the renewed uncertainty of a world no longer stabilized by craft. And this acceptance marks a sharp contrast with Sauron's worldview, because where he sought to eliminate uncertainty entirely, the elves, once aware of the price, chose to live with it, reaffirming the primacy of freedom over permanence. And this choice forced Sauron into a dilemma he had hoped to avoid, because his design relied on subtlety and gradual alignment, not open resistance. And once the elves withdrew their rings, the system of domination could not function as intended without direct confrontation. And Tolkien presents this failure not as a flaw in the ring's power, but as a consequence of free will, because domination requires participation. And once participation is withdrawn, knowingly, force becomes the only remaining option, and this shift marks the transition from deception to war, as Sauron reveals himself openly, abandoning the persona of Annatar and returning to his identity as Dark Lord. And it is important to note that this revelation does not undo the damage already done, because while the elves removed their rings, the knowledge of ringcraft remained and the techniques persisted, and the world had already been reshaped conceptually by the idea that preservation through power was possible. And this lingering influence demonstrates that even resisted domination leaves residue, altering expectations and assumptions long after its rejection. And Tolkien uses this moment to illustrate how awareness interrupts control, but cannot erase history, because choices once made continue to shape the future even when corrected. And the elf's realization also deepens the tragedy of Celebrimbor, who understood too late that the craft he had hoped would redeem his lineage had instead reopened the path to enslavement, and this understanding transformed him from collaborator to resistor, as he worked to conceal and protect the three rings, which had been forged without Sauron's direct involvement, yet were still bound to the same underlying system. And Tolkien's distinction here is subtle but crucial, because the three rings were free of Sauron's immediate touch, yet not of his influence, demonstrating that even well-intentioned creations can remain entangled in corrupt frameworks, if those frameworks are not fully dismantled. And the elves' hearing of the ring thus becomes a moment of awakening rather than resolution, because while it reveals the truth, it also exposes the limits of retreat, forcing the elves to confront the consequences of their earlier trust. And this confrontation reshapes their role in Middle-earth, pushing them away from overt attempts to arrest change and toward a quieter form of stewardship, marked by restraint, secrecy, and gradual withdrawal. And Tolkien reinforces this shift by emphasizing that the elves do not seek to destroy the rings immediately, recognizing both their danger and their potential necessity in resisting Sauron. illustrating the complexity of moral choice in a world where absolute purity is no longer possible. And this complexity underscores one of Tolkien's central themes, that wisdom emerges not from flawless foresight, but from the willingness to change course when understanding deepens, even at great personal cost. And the moment the elves hear the ring therefore resonates far beyond its immediate consequences, because it demonstrates that domination is most vulnerable at the point of recognition, when those it seeks to organize become conscious of the organizing force itself, and this consciousness, once achieved, cannot be fully undone. And although Sauron responds with violence, attempting to reclaim control through war, the seed of resistance planted in this moment will persist across ages, because it affirms that freedom, once felt as absence, can still be chosen deliberately. And Tolkien's portrayal of this awakening is deliberately understated, lacking spectacle, because its true power lies not in action, but in perception, in the quiet realization that something once trusted has become a threat, and the courage required to step away from it, despite the loss that follows. And in this sense, the elves' hearing of the ring becomes a mirror for the audience, inviting reflection on how systems of control often operate unnoticed until alignment becomes pressure, and how the most meaningful acts of resistance begin, not with rebellion, but with the recognition that participation itself has become a form of surrender. And it is this recognition that forces history forward, transforming a concealed plan into open conflict and setting Middle-earth irrevocably on the path toward war, loss, and eventual reckoning. The war that followed the elves' awakening to the One Ring was not an explosion of chaos, but a grim and methodical escalation, because once deception failed, Sauron reverted to force with the same cold precision that had guided his earlier patience, revealing that violence, for him, was never an end but a tool to restore a system that had slipped beyond subtle control. And Tolkien presents this conflict as one born of inevitability rather than surprise, since the foundations of war had already been laid in the architecture of the rings themselves, and when Sauron moved openly against Eregion, his aim was not merely conquest but reclamation, because Celebrimbor and the elvish smiths possessed knowledge he could not allow to exist beyond his reach. And so the war of the elves and Sauron unfolded with a brutality that contrasted sharply with the quiet manipulation that preceded it, as Sauron's forces overwhelmed a region, destroying a realm that had embodied craft, hope, and collaboration. And Tolkien emphasizes the symbolic weight of this destruction, because Eregion falls not as a battlefield victory alone, but as the erasure of an experiment, the violent correction of a deviation from Sauron's intended order. And within this catastrophe, Celebrimbor's fate becomes one of the most tragic episodes of the Second Age, as he resists Sauron despite torture and ruin, refusing to reveal the locations of the three rings. And this refusal marks a final act of moral clarity, because Celebrimbor understands that preservation without freedom is hollow, and that some losses cannot be undone without greater cost, and his death crystallizes the consequences of misplaced trust, showing that repentance, even when sincere, cannot always repair what has been set in motion. And as the war spreads, Tolkien broadens the scope to show how Sauron's ambition extends beyond elvish realms, as he seeks to consolidate Middle-earth under centralized rule, drawing upon alliances with men, and exploiting fear, ambition, and resentment where persuasion alone is insufficient. And this widening conflict reveals another layer of Sauron's strategy, because he does not seek annihilation of cultures, but their subordination, allowing diversity to persist so long as it functions within his hierarchy. And this approach gives his dominion a disturbing durability, as conquered peoples are not erased but reorganized, their traditions hollowed out and repurposed to serve a single will. And Tolkien contrasts this with the resistance of the elves, who, though diminished, fight not for supremacy but for the survival of autonomy itself. And as the war drags on, the limits of elvish power become increasingly clear, because even united they cannot match the industrial scale of Sauron's forces indefinitely, and it is here that the narrative introduces Númenor as a decisive counterweight, a realm of men whose rise had been shaped by the aftermath of Morgoth. Defeat, and Tolkien is careful to portray Númenor not as savior by destiny, but as a complex power motivated by pride, gratitude, and ambition, because while Númenor's intervention turns the tide of war, driving Sauron from Eriador, and forcing him to retreat, it also marks the beginning of a new imbalance, as men, emboldened by victory and strength, begin to see themselves as arbiters of Middle-earth's future, and Sauron, observing this shift, adapts once more, recognizing that Numenor's greatest vulnerability is not military weakness but pride. And although this realization will bear fruit later, its seeds are planted here, during the first great defeat of Sauron, when he is forced to abandon his immediate plans and regroup. And Tolkien frames this retreat not as failure but as transformation, because Sauron learns from this war that domination cannot rely on a single method, and that control over men requires a different approach than control over elves, and this adaptability is what allows him to endure. Because unlike Morgoth, whose rage narrowed his vision, Sauron retains the capacity to reassess and recalibrate even in defeat, and the war culminates not in the destruction of Sauron, but in his temporary withdrawal, leaving Middle-earth scarred, its western regions diminished, and its peoples divided. And Tolkien uses this outcome to underscore a recurring theme. That victory in Middle-earth is often partial and provisional, because the structures that enable domination cannot be dismantled through force alone. And although Sauron's power is checked, the One Ring remains. The knowledge of ringcraft survives in fragments, and the political landscape has shifted irrevocably, setting the stage for future conflicts, and the Elves, having lost a region and many of their greatest works, retreat into a more guarded posture, relying increasingly on secrecy, memory, and endurance rather than open creation, and this withdrawal reflects a deepening awareness of the cost of intervention, as they recognize that attempts to reshape the world actively often invite forces beyond their control. And Tolkien contrasts this with Sauron's response, which is not introspection but redirection, as he consolidates power elsewhere, building strength in the east and south, and preparing for a different kind of confrontation, one that will exploit the weaknesses of men, rather than challenge the resilience of elves directly. And this phase of the war thus becomes a hinge in the history of the Second Age, because it marks the moment when the struggle against Sauron ceases to be primarily an elvish concern, and becomes a shared burden, drawing men into the center of Middle-earth's fate. And Tolkien emphasizes that this transition carries both hope and danger, because men possess adaptability and ambition that can resist domination, but also susceptibility to temptation that can accelerate it. And the first fall of Sauron, as this period comes to be known, is therefore not an ending, but a transformation. A pause that allows new strategies, new alliances, and new vulnerabilities to emerge. And in this pause, the One Ring continues to exist as a silent axis around which future events will turn, unseen but decisive, ensuring that the war's apparent conclusion does not resolve the deeper conflict between freedom and control, but merely postpones its most catastrophic expression. And Tolkien's portrayal of this war is deliberately restrained, focusing less on battlefield heroics and more on consequence, showing how even necessary resistance leaves lasting scars, and how the defeat of a tyrant does not automatically dismantle the conditions that allow tyranny to arise. And in this way, the war against Sauron becomes not a story of triumph, but a lesson in the limits of force, reminding us that domination, once conceptualized and partially realized, cannot be undone easily, because its logic persists in the world long after. Armies withdraw, shaping ambitions, fears, and choices across generations, and it is this persistence that will eventually draw the ring back into history, not through conquest alone, but through loss, pride, and the tragic belief that one final victory might be enough to end the cycle forever. The loss of the One Ring does not occur through triumph or design, but through a slow unraveling shaped by pride, chance, and the quiet indifference of time. Because after Sauron's first great defeat, the ring does not vanish in fire or prophecy, but slips into history almost unnoticed, carried forward by human decision rather than cosmic judgment. And Tolkien frames this phase of the ring story with deliberate restraint, emphasizing that the most consequential turning points often lack spectacle. And at the center of this moment stands Isildur, a figure neither hero nor villain in simple terms, but a man shaped by loss, grief, and sudden proximity to absolute power, because when Sauron is overthrown in the War of the Last Alliance, the ring comes into Isildur's possession not as an object of ambition, but as a token of survival, a remnant taken from the hand of an enemy who had cost him his father and brother. And Tolkien is careful to show that Isildur's claim to the ring is not initially framed as domination, but as recompense, a way of giving meaning to immense personal sacrifice. And this framing is crucial, because it allows the ring to enter human history under the guise of justice rather than temptation. And once this justification is accepted, the path toward corruption becomes almost invisible, as Isildur does not immediately seek to wield the ring's power, but instead begins to reinterpret it as a rightful possession, something earned rather than chosen. And Tolkien presents this shift not as a dramatic fall, but as a subtle narrowing of perspective, where the ring becomes increasingly integrated into Isildur's identity, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of endurance. And this symbolic attachment deepens when Isildur refuses the council to destroy the ring, a refusal often misunderstood as arrogance alone, when in truth it reflects a deeply human reluctance to relinquish meaning in the aftermath of trauma, because to cast the ring into the fire would be to accept that suffering has no tangible compensation, that loss cannot always be redeemed through possession, and Tolkien's insight here is that trauma makes absolute renunciation far more difficult than abstract morality allows. And so Isildur keeps the ring, not to rule, but to remember, and in doing so, he unknowingly perpetuates the conditions for future domination. And when Isildur sets out from Gondor toward the north, intending to entrust the ring to the Keepers of Lore, Tolkien emphasizes that this journey is marked by unease rather than confidence, as Isildur begins to feel the ring's weight not as power but as attachment, sensing that separation would now feel like loss rather than liberation. And this attachment becomes fatal during the disaster of the Gladden Fields, where Isildur, ambushed by orcs, attempts to use the ring not to conquer but to escape. And it is in this moment that Tolkien reveals the ring's true nature as a betrayer rather than a servant, because it slips from Isildur's finger, abandoning him to death, not out of malice, but out of instinct, seeking preservation over loyalty. And this act underscores one of the ring's most defining traits, that it does not serve its bearer, but its own continuation, aligning with Sauron's will even in his absence. And Isildur's death marks the end of the ring's first chapter in human hands. Yet Tolkien resists framing this as punishment, instead presenting it as consequence, the inevitable outcome of possession without understanding. And after Isildur's fall, the ring passes into obscurity, resting in the waters of the Anduin for centuries, unseen, unclaimed, and seemingly inert. And this long concealment is not a period of dormancy so much as waiting, because Tolkien emphasizes that the ring possesses a form of awareness, not consciousness in the human sense, but a persistent orientation toward its maker. And this orientation guides its movements across time, allowing it to remain hidden when discovery would lead to destruction, and to surface when circumstances become favorable. And the ring's long absence from history contributes to its mythic status, as memory of its existence fades, knowledge fragments, and warnings lose urgency, creating a world increasingly unprepared to recognize its significance when it reemerges. And this fading of knowledge is as important as the ring's physical concealment, because it illustrates how time itself becomes an ally of domination, eroding vigilance and turning catastrophe into legend. And Tolkien's portrayal of this era is intentionally sparse, reflecting the ring's own withdrawal from events. Yet the consequences of its absence are profound, as Sauron's power, diminished but not extinguished, begins to reconstitute itself without immediate opposition, and the ring's concealment delays confrontation, allowing structures of resistance to weaken and memories of unity to dissolve. And this delay is not neutral, because it ensures that when the ring is found again, it will enter a world less prepared to understand its danger. And Tolkien's narrative choice to let centuries pass without resolution reinforces one of his central themes, that evil often survives not through constant action, but through patience, allowing the world to forget what vigilance once required. And when the ring is eventually found by chance, rather than design, by a creature as far removed from ambition as possible, Tolkien underscores the irony that the most powerful object in Middle-earth does not re-enter history through kings or warriors, but through accident. And this accident is not random, because it aligns with the ring's instinct for survival, seeking bearers unlikely to destroy it or use it openly, and thus the ring's passage into obscurity becomes not a failure of its purpose, but a refinement of its strategy, preserving itself until conditions align once more. And in this sense, the ring's loss is not an end, but a transformation, shifting its influence from direct domination to latent corruption, allowing it to shape events indirectly through absence rather than presence. And Tolkien uses this prolonged silence to heighten the tragedy of later ages, because when the ring resurfaces, it does so in a world that has forgotten how close it once came to destruction. And this forgetting ensures that the burden of recognition will fall upon those least prepared to bear it, setting the stage for a story not of ancient wars, but of small lives drawn into a conflict that history itself has failed to resolve. And in this way, the ring's loss to time becomes one of its most effective acts, demonstrating that domination need not be visible to persist, and that the greatest dangers often arise not from what is remembered vividly, but from what has been allowed to fade into the background of myth, where it waits patiently for the moment when it can return. The true meaning of the One Ring does not lie in its power to conquer, corrupt, or destroy, but in what it reveals about the nature of power itself, because Tolkien did not conceive the ring as a simple symbol of evil, but as a reflection of a deeper moral conflict that runs through all of Middle-earth, the conflict between freedom and control, between acceptance of limitation and the desire to eliminate uncertainty, and it is this conflict that gives the ring its enduring resonance, because the ring does not impose a single temptation upon all who encounter it, but adapts to the inner logic of each bearer, offering not what they want superficially, but what they believe is necessary. And this adaptability is crucial, because it shows that corruption does not arise from desire alone, but from the conviction that one's desire justifies overriding the autonomy of others. And throughout the ring's long history, those who fall under its influence do not do so because they seek evil, but because they seek solutions, and Tolkien is precise in illustrating that the ring amplifies intent rather than inventing it, transforming concern into compulsion, responsibility into authority, and protection into domination. And this is why the ring proves more dangerous to the wise than to the ignorant, because wisdom brings with it the capacity to imagine outcomes, to foresee suffering, and to justify intervention. And the ring exploits this foresight by offering certainty in place of doubt, presenting a world ordered according to a single, coherent will, as preferable to one shaped by countless imperfect choices. And this logic aligns perfectly with Sauron's own vision, which sought not chaos but harmony enforced through hierarchy. And by binding his essence to the ring, Sauron did not create an external weapon, but externalized his philosophy, embedding it into an object that could propagate his worldview even in his absence. And Tolkien's insight here is subtle, because it shows that domination does not require the continued presence of the dominator, only the survival of the system they design. And the ring is precisely such a system, operating independently, seeking bearers who will advance its preservation, its secrecy, and its return, not through command but through alignment of desire. And this alignment explains why the ring does not simply compel obedience, but encourages rationalization, allowing bearers to believe they act freely, even as their choices narrow. And Tolkien emphasizes that the ring's corruption is gradual, not because it is weak, but because gradual change preserves the illusion of self-direction, making resistance feel unnecessary until it becomes impossible. And this illusion is the ring's greatest strength, because it transforms domination into self-expression. And this transformation is evident in every bearer, from Isildur, who saw the ring as rightful compensation, to Gollum, who saw it as identity and survival, to Boromir, who saw it as a means of defense, and even to Frodo, whose resistance is not absolute immunity, but endurance sustained through humility, friendship, and the absence of ambition. And Tolkien's portrayal of Frodo's struggle is critical, because it demonstrates that the ring cannot be mastered through willpower alone, and that victory over domination does not come from superiority, but from refusal to participate in its logic. And this refusal is not heroic in the conventional sense, because it involves suffering, loss, and the acceptance of failure as a possibility. And Tolkien is explicit that no one, not even the most virtuous, can claim the ring and remain unchanged, because to claim it is to accept its premise, that the world must be shaped through centralized control, And this premise stands in direct opposition to Tolkien's moral vision, which values freedom precisely because it allows for error, growth, and moral responsibility, and the destruction of the ring, therefore, is not a triumph of strength or strategy, but a rejection of a worldview, a decision to accept uncertainty rather than eliminate it, and this decision cannot be made by those who desire power, but only by those willing to relinquish it entirely. And even then, Tolkien shows that the act requires mercy, chance, and cooperation beyond individual intent, because Frodo does not destroy the ring through resolve alone, and this is intentional, reinforcing the idea that domination cannot be undone through domination's tools, but only through a convergence of humility, compassion, and the willingness to accept incomplete victory. And when the ring is finally destroyed, what ends is not only Sauron's power, but the assumption that order must be enforced from above, allowing Middle-earth to enter an age where freedom persists without guardianship. And Tolkien underscores that this freedom is fragile, imperfect, and burdened with loss, but preferable to any peace imposed through control, and the ring's end marks the restoration of moral agency to the world, returning responsibility to those who must live with the consequences of their choices. And this restoration is the true resolution of the ring's story, because it affirms that the cost of freedom is uncertainty, and that this cost cannot be avoided without sacrificing the very dignity that makes life meaningful. And Tolkien's final judgment on the ring is therefore not that power is evil, but that power which seeks to eliminate the need for choice inevitably becomes tyrannical, regardless of intent. And by tracing the ring's origin from grief and preservation to domination and collapse, Tolkien invites reflection on how societies respond to fear of loss, whether they choose control disguised as care or courage tempered by restraint. And in this sense, the One Ring is not merely an artifact of fantasy, but a mirror held up to the reader, asking not what we would do with power, but what we are, willing to surrender in order to feel secure. And the answer Tolkien offers is not comforting, but honest, that security purchased through domination is hollow, that preservation without freedom is stagnation, and that the only enduring resistance to corruption lies not in mastery, but in the quiet, difficult choice to let the world remain open, uncertain, and shared, even when the cost is great. And it is this choice, repeated across ages by different hands, that ultimately defeats the ring, not because it destroys power, but because it refuses to become it, closing the long arc of the ring's history not with control restored, but with control relinquished. And in that relinquishment, Middle-earth is finally allowed to move forward, unbound